Hello, hello, hello. It's Holly Rustick here with Grant Writing and Funding, and I'm super excited to celebrate Women's History Month with you all, as well as International Grants Professional Day in March. So to celebrate that, I wanted to put together a webinar for you and also a checklist. So please do download the checklist. It's in the comment section below, so you can grab that. This is Celebrating Women in Nonprofits. And we have a lot of mini podcasts this week that also and on our YouTube channel that go along with this. So please do subscribe to our YouTube channel and be sure you get notifications because we have so much goodness coming for you in the grant writing and funding world, and specifically around gender and nonprofits. And I'm going to explain all the reasons why in this free webinar that we're offering right now. All right, so this is how nonprofit leaders can identify gender inequity and create a path toward equity in your nonprofit. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started here. Once again, we are celebrating Women's History Month and International Grant Professionals Day, and that's 82% of grant professionals are female. So we are definitely celebrating this and really wanting to tie in some different stats about what's going on with gender in the nonprofit industry, right? So just a little bit about me. If you don't know much about me, I'm a regional and national trainer and speaker, #1 best-selling author in grant writing. I also host the Grant Writing and Funding podcast and the Grant Writing and Funding YouTube channel. So be sure to subscribe to those as you get a ton of great resources. I also have created very, very powerful programs. One is the on-demand freelance grant writing master course. Another is our annual, so a year-long grant professional mentorship. So if you really want to increase your business in grant writing, do look at getting on our waitlist or joining the program. And then our online grant writing master course that you can dive in at any time to increase your grant writing skills with our proven system. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. And let's just go over what you're going to learn in this webinar. Once again, we do have the workbook, which is a checklist, and I definitely encourage you to download that. We are going to identify gender disparity in the overall system. We're going to understand why and how gender disparity exists in nonprofits, and then we're going to create a path forward for gender equity in your nonprofits. We're going to go through how to do that. So let's go ahead and get started. But before we do, let's just make some forward notes for y'all. So I am using the word gender versus sex, and this is a choice of words. Gender is the word utilized to articulate the social meanings that we impose on sexes. Also, please note, we're going to be talking about money in this webinar, right? And that can bring up different trauma. And this is also, I'm not trying to shame nonprofits, I'm trying to create accountability, right? So this webinar is definitely provided, it's providing you with solutions forward to create healthier nonprofits, but we do need to look at the stats and we do need to look at the data, understand where we are, and to really analyze your nonprofit. As here it says here, much of gender disparities are not malicious, but are embedded within the system. So we're going to look at that very fully in this webinar. And then intersectionality. I also wanted to point this out as well. Gender disparity does not exist in its own silo of merely just women versus men, right? We have, once again, there's different genders, right? But there's also race, class, sexuality, nationality, and abilities, different abilities. They all have a role to play as well. And then, of course, we have women versus we have BIPOC women versus LGBTQ, non-binary, different abilities, other types of inclusions as well. There is a huge data gap though, right? Even though women make up 50% of the population and nearly 75% inside the nonprofit sector, but there's a huge data gap on all of these different intersectionalities, right? So this webinar is just focusing on women in general. And when I have data to pull up different things, I do use that. But once again, there is a huge data gap. And that's also to kind of put the word out there and say, hey, if you're passionate about any type of intersection, do the research and let me know. Like, I would love to have more data on this, but from what I could gather from my deep research on this, I've been able to include that and kept it very broad in those terms. So I just wanted to put that on the table. All right, so more on intersectionality as well as it doesn't exist on its own. Once again, there's other discrimination, unpaid labor, right? Male violence against women, the female body, right? Just in general. So we're going to focus on the system to change and our place within that system to make radical change so we can really fill the gaps by changing the paradigm. And that's what this webinar is really about, is these paradigm shifts. So let's go ahead and get into this. We're going to look at it in the system first. I really want to lay out the system of some types of discrimination and inequity, right? To lay that out before that, then we're going to get into nonprofit specific, and then we're going to get into what you can do to create a solution. So let's just look at the disparity first. And overall, how does this happen, right? Whiteness and maleness can only go without saying because most other identities never get said at all. Because male data makes up a majority of what we know, what is male has come to be seen as universal, right? It leads to the positioning of women, half the global population, as a minority. And this is said by Perez, and I have all of my resources and references in that checklist too. So if you'd like to get more on all of the resources I have, definitely get the checklist. But overall, this is what they're talking about. Perez is, referring to male and whiteness is just kind of the go-to. And I'm going to break this down more so you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? Okay. Simone de Beauvoir said humanity is male, and man defines woman not in herself, but as relative to him. She is not regarded as an autonomous being. He is the subject, he is the subject, he is the absolute, and she is the other. So what do I mean by this? It's called the default maleness. And I'm not male bashing at all. I'm just saying that this is what it is, right? So when we talk about anything in general, and we're going to look at this, even stuffed animals, we automatically refer to them. It's called the default maleness. It's the he, right, that we refer to. Even think about this. When caveman bones are found, do we ever say cave woman bones? No, we always refer to it as cavemen, right? So here's part of that default maleness. Emojis, let's look at it more in current day, right? Emojis, the natural first ones, the original, were natural default male and white. And thank God there's now genders and colors, right? In a study, and this is what I was saying before, even stuffed animals are naturally referred to as male unless they're super feminine, like dresses and bows and that stuffed animals' hair. And these even account for animals. It's not just people, it's animals even. So the default is you see a teddy bear, you say, oh, that teddy bear is he, what's his name, right? So this is like the default maleness that we see and that we exist in our current culture in the West. So here's another study was done, a 2007 international study of 25,439 children's teen characters. Only 13% of non-human characters were female. So we're even seeing, here, 50% of the world is made up of women, right? Of female. And then, but even with characters on TV, we're only seeing 13% representing female. Here's another little nugget for you. Men actors have twice as many roles as females. Even when females are the leading character, male counterparts appear just as often on the screen. And here's a big one for you. Only 48 of 196 countries feature a woman on one of their bills, their monetary bills. Even though the US said it would put Harriet Tubman on the $20 bills, they still haven't. So this really goes to show you there is a lot of just default maleness, default very singular heterosexual kind of views, right? And how does this tie into nonprofits? We're going to get into that. But first, I just wanted to paint the picture of the system and the culture that we exist in currently, so you can really understand, like I said, a lot of the things within nonprofits, even though there's a lot of inequity, it's not that people are malicious. It's not that they're being malicious in a lot of times, right? It's existing in this system and existing in this culture. And for us to really understand and create a path forward, we need to be aware of it, right? Because until you're aware of it, you might have never thought about some of these things before and been like, oh, wow, okay, that might have really, maybe I've made decisions that are very biased and I didn't even realize it. But now we can realize it, we can change, right? So another thing I wanted to talk about, this really relates to capital and money, is in 1974, women finally got the ability to have their own credit card. Honestly, that was 2 years before I was born. Okay, that was not that long ago. Right? So, also women-led startups received, this is much more recent, just received 2.3% of VC funding in 2020. 2.3% of venture capitalism funding. That's hardly anything. And even Black-owned startups, only 0.6% of VC funding. So we really need to look at investing in women, investing in Black-owned businesses, et cetera, because otherwise, how are we actually going to change the narrative, right? And here's another statistic for you, is women earn only 83 cents to every dollar a white man earns, while Black women only earn 64 cents to every dollar a white male earns. So there's a lot of disparity in this in general with capital and with money, right? So definitely we want to look at this. Here's a chart as well that can really show you what the differences is. The only women that we're really seeing are kind of on par with white men or Asian women, which is, I think in this instance too, it's very East Asian, right? Because Asian is quite a large geographic area. So very interesting. So now let's get into the nonprofit. So now we understand, okay, in the culture, in the space, in our times, this is some of the inequity that we see. What about in our industry, in the nonprofit industry? Well, let's look at this, okay? So to really understand a lot of this, we also need to understand the nonprofit as a part of the overall system, right? So we really saw a lot of nonprofits and NGOs, non-government organizations, being institutionalized very soon after in the 1960s, right? And this is when the government was contracting a lot of services with nonprofits, et cetera. So now we saw the institutionalization. And what I mean by that is nonprofits actually becoming 501c3, IRS, right? Having to submit to the IRS, et cetera. And another factor behind this time was not only did the United States government say, hey, we want to start contracting out some of the services to nonprofits so we don't have to do it all. It was also a huge movement because of the civil rights movement, right? And a lot of those were based on social justice movements. And we're hearing that more and more these days coming back, the social justice movement, right? So here's the thing. Some people argue that money was actually funneled into anti-radical movements to forestall any kind of protest and to steer public policy. So this was steering it towards more individual services. So if you think about a social justice movement, right, we're thinking about people coming together, wanting to change a huge policy, wanting to change, a paradigm shift in how things operate. Whereas if you think about it, if you're actually an incorporated nonprofit, are you really doing that anymore? Not really, right? And part of the reason is, we're going to talk about that. You're actually delivering more individual services than you are a part of a huge public policy shift. And so we looked at IRS tax exempt 501c3 status, right? What does that equal when you become incorporated? No lobbying allowed, except in very limited amounts. If you're a 501c4, those types of things. But most of the 501c3, no lobbying allowed, and that cuts off your ability to influence policy, to change policy, to advocate for certain lawmakers, right? All of a sudden, you've gotten this huge benefit of being a social justice movement taken away from you. Now, the other thing is, we're getting grants, right? So let's talk about grants now for a minute. So many grants from the federal government are very restricted, right? You're out there and you're providing a lot of, you wanted to provide a lot of prevention programs. That's very difficult to get funding. It's easier to get funding to actually put like systems or services in place after the fact, right? Not to prevent things from happening, but to serve people after something's happened to them. So very interesting shift in just even the paradigm of what your movements are trying to create and change once you become institutionalized. And this is a reason many of you may not want to become nonprofits, okay? So you can still do change without becoming a nonprofit that's institutionalized. or looking at what type of incorporation that you can still, if you still want to lobby, becoming a 501c6, becoming a 501c4, looking at the different types. So this was really a look away from social justice movements and towards social services, delivering the services. And if you want more on this, Voulez is awesome. He really talks a lot about this in the nonprofit Hunger Games. So this also impacts gender equity, right? And how does it impact gender equity? Let's look at that. Well, a lot of the funding constraints and funding restrictions in grants, right? So we're looking at, okay, you can only spend it on this. You can only have a certain percentage of your admin budget to, do certain things within the grant, et cetera. So how does this impact nonprofits, and how does this maybe make you compromise? Have you ever had any of these thoughts? But what will funders think if I give 40 paid weeks to employees for parental leave? Will they be upset about that? Does that seem too much, right? This grant doesn't allow enough funding for a full-time person. I'll just take them out and I'll still fulfill all the outcomes without staff. How many times have you guys done that? I must change half of my vocabulary to meet the requirements of the grant. I can't use the word survivor. They want to use the word victim. I can't use the word activism. They want to use engagement, etc. And that might sound like, okay, I'm just changing a word, but words are powerful. And if you're really about we're serving survivors because we want to empower them and not make them feel like they're victims, but they're actually survivors. Or we want to, we're not just talking about engagement, we're talking about activism, right? Some of these words you just can't use. And it's really interesting, and it really disempowers your cause. Hardly any funds for prevention. So we'll just do the social service programs, like I mentioned before. Maybe you wanted to do something about preventing rape in your community. There's no money for prevention. So now you're just going to have services that provide services for victims or survivors who have been raped, right? And then all of a sudden you're not focusing on solving the problem. It's like the Band-Aid effect, right? So here's how that can really separate it when you look at what types of restrictions there are and how this really impacts the way your nonprofit thinks. So another thing to consider is representation is important, but it's not everything. Now, you might kind of go, oh, Holly, that rubbed me the wrong way that you said that, but let me explain, okay? Overall, nonprofits are highly represented by female, right? We got 75% of nonprofit employees are female, right? They're women. 42% of nonprofit boards are led by women, right? And only 22% of nonprofits are run by a woman executive director, a CEO. So here we have representation in the nonprofit sector. So it should be completely equitable, right? Well, no, because if we just thought back to, I painted the whole kind of culture, level, outside the nonprofit, and now we're going to start digging into it. Here's the thing. Even though you have representation, it doesn't mean everyone has equal power, okay? So we see that disparity widens as operating budgets rise. So this is really interesting. Women make up 56% of chief executives at nonprofits with annual budgets of less than 1 million. But as soon as we get to that 1 million and above mark, it drops dramatically. Only 22% now are represented now, right? So let me look, I'll show you that here as well on the graph in a second. But automatically women, just as soon as they enter the door, you can see this graph here, there's already deductions against us. Whether or not you have kids, whether or not you've entered a low paid career, whatever, you're automatically deducted. Whoa, so that's kind of like that 83% or 83 cents per dollar, right? Compared to a man. So pay gaps at nonprofits for female CEOs with a budget of less than 1 million experience median pay gaps of between 6% and 13% compared to their male CEOs, right? At larger nonprofits where men outnumber women, the gap is even larger. So we're not just looking at representation gap at that point, we're looking at pay gaps. That's huge. So all of a sudden there's an 18% pay gap. So even of the 22% women that are CEOs at $1 million plus per year, annual operating budgets per year, right? there's still, not only are there fewer women at that level, they have an 18% pay gap on average. So overall, females earn about 24.8% less than males in the nonprofit sector, 75% of the nonprofit sector. So what's going on here, right? So part of this is that nonprofit work is historically tied to women's work, so it's underpaid automatically. So if we looked at this representation, here's the graph I was talking about. So we're really looking at, okay, on average, you see women, you know, they're very well represented and under $1 million to 2.5 million per annual operating year, and then it really changes drastically as we go up. So what about you? What have you say? But we're all female. We're mostly female. We have more than 75% female, not my nonprofit. Well, let's look at this. Once again, it is more than just about representation. It's about who holds the power, right? So even Save the Children, they have scored amazing in the gender equity assessment by Gender Fair. They have been around since the suffrage movement were founded in that era, where, you know, have female leaders, everything. But when they took this assessment in 2018, they saw that they had gender-based pay gaps. So it's, you know, really looking, and that's what I'm going to say, we're going to be doing this checklist because it's really important. So, so really important. So let's go ahead and get into it. A way toward nonprofit gender equity. All right, so let's look at it. How we reshape the culture is we look at, does your nonprofit conduct gender equity? Do you actually do it? Does your nonprofit institutionalize gender equity processes within the nonprofit, right? Are you doing this annually? Does your nonprofit take action on gender equity? And is your nonprofit part of the voice in challenging this system that we're in? All right, so let's go ahead and look at it and let's break this down. Number one, so let's get into your assessment here. Conduct a recruitment self-audit. All right, so does your hiring process seek diversity in the qualified applicant pool for positions? Are you actually seeking diversity? Are you going out there? Are you trying to get into different spaces? Are you advertising in different spaces so you can create more diversity of just people applying, right? When writing position descriptions, do you seek employee input and develop consensus for position descriptions? Where are you posting the positions? Are your job descriptions realistic? Are you saying you have to do everything? And this is one of the huge flaws that I see in people trying to recruit any kind of nonprofit employee or an executive director, CEO, is saying, like, they have just the wish list is what they really like. The wish list of, like, in a normal company, it'd be like 5 people doing all of the jobs that are put on a job description for somebody that works at a nonprofit. Almost impossible for someone to say, I can do all of that or have experience in all of it. So really make sure you're being realistic. And part of that is getting input from other people that work at your nonprofit. Do you not require previous salaries? Okay, so this is something to say. I've seen a lot where they say, what was your previous salary, etc. Now, how can this create inequity? It can create inequity because if just naturally, say a woman hasn't been working for the last 5 years because she's been home taking care of the kids and everything else and doing all of the things. And she may not have as much experience, right? Because of the overall system, or she had just never had that high of a salary before because, once again, of the overall system compared to a man. So then if you're just saying, okay, where have you been? I'm just going to base the salary I'm going to give you on where you're kind of coming from. That's not really equitable, right? It's not equitable at all. So it's really important to understand where not to put in previous salaries. So how does negotiation affect entry-level salaries? Are men able to negotiate higher starting salaries than women or minorities, right? So are you looking, or do you have negotiations? A lot of times they say don't do negotiations, right? We're going to talk about that a little bit. And the other thing to note really is here is that, this kind of goes back to what is that position description for that job? Women don't apply for jobs like men. Studies show that men often apply for jobs when they only meet 60% of the qualifications. But women will only apply if they meet 100% because they want to be successful. They want to say, hey, well, this is what you said I need, so I'm only going to apply if I can reach that. So really looking at, be very realistic in your job description. Don't put it in the whole everything in the kitchen sink. For one thing, it's just not realistic and people aren't going to feel like a success. For another thing, you're going to shut out a lot of people who really want to be able to show up and do everything that you're asking, and they just won't apply if they don't think they can do it. So really do put in that, and that can help you just automatically create more equity in your recruitment. All right, so let's go to number 2. Number 2 is evaluate your compensation system for internal equity. So now let's look internally. So our first one was job recruitment, recruiting people to come in. Now let's look at what's already happening within your system. All right. Do you have a method to determine your salaries and benefits? Do you even have anything, or are you just kind of like going off the cuff? What do we got in the grant? Right? No, first create what would actually make sense so you can really recruit someone and be able to retain them. Do you have a consistent job evaluation system? Right? Are jobs actually scored or assigned grades? Are positions where women and minorities work scored or graded according to the same standards as where men and non-minorities work, right? That is something you really need to look at in your system. Your HR department, this is a lot of HR stuff, but even if you don't have an HR department, this is something your board should really be doing. Could a method be used for ensuring consistent pay for people with substantially similar levels of experience or education who hold jobs calling for substantially similar degrees of skill, effort, responsibilities, working conditions, even though the job titles might be different? So here we are. We might have somebody who is applying to be a CEO, and on their former jobs, they were an executive assistant, right? And maybe somebody else that's also applying for the job, their formal job title was secretary. But if we look through, a lot of their experience, etc., is the same. It's just the title was different. So automatically I'm gonna say, oh, they were just a secretary. Oh, so they weren't paid as much because executive assistant sounds more like whatever, right? So it's really looking at what do they bring to the table, right? So that's really important. And this is as they go up in your organization too, right? So that can also help you say, how are we creating titles? Is the title even equitable? Can workers negotiate their pay? So if they can negotiate their pay when they're in your system, are women doing it as much as men? Because a lot of times women aren't going to negotiate as much. It's just not how they're in the system right now, right? It doesn't mean they shouldn't be able to get higher pay as well. And it shouldn't be something that only men can do, or just because men are doing it, they're the only ones who are getting pay raises. How long do men, women, and minorities stay within job grades or scores before moving up? So really analyze that too. If they are moving up within your organization and people are getting promoted, really analyze who has it been, what gender are they, etc. So you can have a historical context to say what's happening here. If you're seeing white men moving up a lot quicker, what is the reason for that? Is it just because they're negotiating more? Is it because they're applying to positions they're not 100% qualified to apply for, but they're at least applying to them? What are some of those things? All right, number 3, evaluate your compensation system for industry competitiveness. Now, this is something to really look at. Do you have a method to determine the market rate for any given job? So this can also help you with figuring out too, like what are these kind of norms of pricing you're giving out, right? As far as different roles. So that can help you. An executive director, is that comparable to somebody that's running a CEO of a similar annual operating budget, that sort of thing, even if it's a for-profit, right? Looking at these different roles, executive assistant, right? For-profit or nonprofit, like where are they going? Where is this at? So this is really important to look at as well. And can you be confident that men are not being compensated at or above market rates, while women and minority workers are compensated at or below market rates? So that is something to really look at in your nonprofit to say, what are men getting paid compared to the market rate? What are women, minorities getting paid to the market rate? Okay, do you challenge basic assumptions about the value of skills before assigning points or grades. So if you're looking at this and you're looking at, I'm going to assign certain points or grades to this, do you consider caring for sick people and as unpaid labor? Is this a value, right? So this is really important to consider as well. If somebody comes in and they have been home taking care of the kids, running a house, doing the homeschooling, are you giving that the same weight as you would someone who's a teacher or somebody else who's doing a lot of the different same roles, right? Just because they're unpaid doesn't mean they're less experienced in a lot of terms, right? Do you consider whether the market has undercompensated certain occupations or professions before adjustments? Let's just look at teacher rates, for example. That's a huge job, educating, right? Is that typically underpaid actually? So should you just follow the market rate then? Or should you actually think about going up above the market rate because maybe the market isn't exactly fair, right? So these are all things to consider. Number 4, assess how raises are awarded. So we want to look and say, do men, women, and minorities receive consistent raises based on similar performance standards, right? Are all workers with outstanding evaluations awarded the same percentage increases? If not, what are those differences? So really looking at awards, different awards and all of that, raises, promotions, etc. Are men and women and minorities with similar levels of performance awarded bonuses on a consistent basis? Do they receive bonuses of similar monetary values, right? So that's another thing to really look at. Are you actually, historically, then you could say, how many raises have we given, if you've given any, or any kind of fringe benefits, right? Even who are those given to, etc. Number 5, evaluate employee training, development, and promotion opportunities. All right, so this is a great way. How are workers selected for participation in training opportunities or special projects that lead to advancement? So you can really, once again, historically look at this. Are we actually seeing a lot more men getting the training? And then if the men are getting more of the training, then they can add that to their resumes and then they're getting the promotion. So this kind of follows the whole system that we're talking about as far as HR really looking at what are the causes if there is inequity. And this is where you can find those, because it might just be more of the men are applying for the training, so they're able to increase and get more promotions, right? So that would be like, hey, we need to give more training to women as well. So looking at that, are there differences by race or gender, right? So that's also something to consider, like really looking at it. If so, what can we do to widen the pool to reflect the opportunity? Number 6, this is a big one. Ensure your organization practices transparency. This is one that you can do like this, and it's going to help create more equity automatically. Do you regularly post job openings and salary ranges within the workplace, right? So that's just one thing to be like, hey, do you actually include this salary on the job announcement or on the job posting? Is that somewhere where people in the workplace can see it? Do you publish your compensations publicly? So, and I just want to pause here for a second. This is really important because a lot of times what I've seen in the past is nonprofits will say, hey, we want you to do all of the things, remember in that job listing, and then, you know, just put your previous amount salaries that you've gotten paid and then tell us what you want. And it's like, what? That's going to create so much inequity. Instead, your nonprofit should be like, these are the things we're going to offer. These are the things we're looking for. And this is how much we're going to pay for the job. For one thing, that's going to cut down on your vetting so much. You're not going to have to go back and forth with people all the time. And you're really going to be able to find what you're looking for. And then it's going to create more equity in the workspace, because now if I know what you're getting paid, they're getting paid, etc., naturally that's going to cause you to be more equitable, right? You're not going to want to have Joe over there getting like, you know, so much more money than Sally, who they have very similar job duties. Like they're going to know, and that's not going to make Sally feel well if Joe's getting paid so much more for the same type of value and experience that she brings to the table. Automatically, that's going to create more equity. Number 7, provide benefits that work to sustain gender equity. Okay, so do you provide adequate maternity leave and paternity leave? Are you following the law? There is a law to that, right? Are you surpassing that law? Do you account for the unpaid labor and caregiving responsibilities that women incur, right? There's a lot more that women incur. We saw this even during the COVID-19 pandemic and throughout it, right? In the beginning, men were like, okay, I'm doing some. And then all of a sudden, the disparity went huge. Men were in their rooms working, and women were trying to be in their rooms working too, but also taking care of the children and the education and everything else and all the household duties. So we saw this disparity increase actually. So does your nonprofit account for that? Do you have flexibility to work from home? I know all nonprofits cannot do that, but this could be something to create more equity. Number 8, assess your facility to account for 75% of your population. Remember, 75% of your population is female. So here's some things that you can consider that you may not have ever thought of, right? Do you actually consider women bodies, right, in your facility? And that means like temperatures aren't only set for men's bodies. We've seen a lot of nonprofits, all the women are wearing sweaters, men are fine, right? But you have 75% of your people in sweaters. Glass ceiling or glass stairs, okay, and glass ceilings do break those. But glass stairs that easily show up women's dresses, right? Do you have those? Cabinets that women can actually reach aren't super high. Women are naturally shorter than men on average, right? So we want to create more equity. Doors, are they super heavy or hard to close? Here's a big one. If 75% of your population on average is women, wouldn't you want to have more square footage for the women's bathrooms? This blows my mind. ADA compliance. This is also to help other abilities, right? Pregnancy parking, is that something you have? Remote working, laptops, desks, etc. So those are all things that you can really think about in your facility to really make it more equitable automatically. Number 9, gender equity buy-in training and centralized groups. So do you include gender equity policy buy-in from the executive director and the board? So we really want to make sure that the board and all of the policies are supported or support all of this. So we want to make sure we have gender equitable, inclusive workplace, diversity, anti-harassment, and non-discrimination policies and guidelines. So do you actually even have these policies and guidelines? And just to go on a little bit more on number 9 here, do you provide gender equity training from experts? That could be a great thing for your board to actually go through, and your nonprofit staff. Do you have a cross-department gender group? And this is something that Save the Children said they also put into place to make it more equitable, was they started to have a cross-department gender group. So it wasn't just, it was women from all the different levels and hierarchy coming together. It was different people coming together and looking at gender groups. So it was great to have people in all different areas come together to say, are we actually promoting this? Are we, how is our gender equity going? And this is a great way that you can come together. Number 10, conduct focus groups and surveys. So are you actually conducting surveys, focus groups on all of that? Oh, I said surveys twice, but include employees, volunteers, constituents, board members, funders, all of that. Are you actually going out there and asking them about gender equity? Here's a great example was and the newsroom kind of came together and had this survey about gender equity, and they said they remember their constituents as allies. So when survivors access their nonprofit for support, they see them less as clients and more as potential comrades in a struggle for social justice. So really redesigning the way you look at people who access your programs even. Number 11, here it is, integrate gender equity into your budgets for your programs, right? You can definitely include this in grants. You can support gender equity goals into your programming and so much more. So, to do a lot of this work, yes, you are going to need maybe some funding for some of it, right? So how can you get that funding? Start putting it inside your budgets. Start asking for it in your grants. Number 12, ensure that there are accountability measures for growing your gender equity. So include measures that restore imbalances, create safe spaces for women to talk, build training to support men as allies, and really understand who has the power here. Are we actually having an equal representation of power? Remember, not just an equal representation, but of people actually making the decisions. Number 13, advertising and communication for equity. And this was a podcast that I did with Mary Gladstone Highland, and she really talked about sharing stories that honor dignity of clients, right? And what some of this, what she talked about is what types of images and branding are you using for your nonprofit? So are you showing pictures of different races, of different sexes, of different, is it very diverse? Because a lot of times if you go into like stock photos or whatever, because you don't want to maybe show your actual clients, right? Because there's privacy issues. But a lot of stock photos, a lot of them are white men, right? So this is also a way of how are you actually integrating what your nonprofit represents into this? Another thing to look at, are you client shaming to tug hearts for funding? So how are you actually communicating the stories of the people you serve, or with the social movement justice or the social justice movements, right, that you are serving? Are you actually client shaming, or are you presenting them in good light? So another thing to really look at is your advertising and communication. 14, this is a wonderful one. Ensure supplier diversity, okay? Where are you getting your supplies for your nonprofit? Are you getting them from women-owned businesses as well? Are you asking about that? So are you supporting Black-owned, Latino-owned, other marginalized businesses? This is something that you can start incorporating in your supplies, in how you curate your supplies, and all of that. So you can definitely put that into your vendor. We want to support more local-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, Black-owned, Latino-owned, etc. And that can be a great way to do that. And not just supplies, but if you're renting out spaces for certain things, if you're all the different things that you're working with for supplier diversity and any type of procurement. And number 15, finally we're at 15, funder and partner supported, right? Do your funders and partners support equity? Okay, are those people that you still want to be aligned with, and do you want to help educate them and tell them what you're doing? Do your funders and partners know about equity? Are you actually taking the time to educate them? Where your dollars go for equity? What your overall social justice movement is? This is a great way to actually start talking to them about it. Do you advocate with your partners? Do you actually do things together to advocate? So these are all different things, these 15. This is a big checklist. Once again, you can download the checklist. But overall, as we wrap up here, making gender equity as a core value of your nonprofit is actually a human right. All right, it's not only a representation. It's not just a side project to do on the side. It's not about the bottom line, how much money you can make, although I would argue that you can make a lot more money when it's more equitable, but it's not about that. What it really is about is the effect on all social justice movements and reshaping the culture. It's really about a human right. So as you're looking at how equitable your nonprofit is or is not, and then reshaping it, remember you're doing the nonprofit industry huge justice by really raising the level of how equitable it can be. So once again, do download your workbook so you can do this on your own and go through your checklist for your nonprofit. And you will also get all of these different sources as well in the downloadable. These were all where I got the information from today in this webinar. And also, if you'd like more of this, do sign up, do subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also subscribe to our free Hub Haven email list and our grant writing and funding podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in with me to this free webinar to celebrate National Women's History Month and International Grants Professional Day. And I do just encourage you to become, have your nonprofit be more equitable and really, sit down and rethink these things, because it's just going to help the future and the present of nonprofits out there. Thank you again. I'm Holly Rustick with Grant Writing and Funding. Thanks so much.